Welcome to episode 213, How to Manage Entitlement, Complacency, and the Ego on Your Team with Payal Sharma. Welcome to the Be That 1% podcast. I'm your host, James Silvis, mindset specialist and performance coach. And here on the show, I'm going to challenge you to think deeper, commit to greatness, and develop a stronger mindset. You'll hear stories from those who are living life on their terms, and you'll receive strategies that will help you level up. So the question is, are you ready to be your own 1%? Let's get started. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Be That 1% podcast. Today, I am so excited because anytime I get to speak and connect with my dear friend Payal, soul sister, we just create so much just insight. And Payal's mind is, if she were a part of the X-Men, her superpower would be connecting ideas and devouring research effortlessly, at least it seems. And she can articulate things in very helpful ways that take complex ideas and make them super simple. And so anytime I have the opportunity to connect with her, I know my mind always gets going. I'm sure hers does as well. She's also been on the podcast 2 additional times on top of this one. And I'll reference those episodes in the show notes. So go check those out because those are going to be equally as powerful as this one's going to be. But Payal is a assistant professor of management at UNLV. She studies power. She does research all over the country with epic minds. We've done some research together. Most importantly, though, she is a heart-centered leader, and she is doing her best to impact the world through the ideas that she comes up with, studies, and is able to create a framework around for you to use. So without further ado, Payal, welcome to the show.
James, thank you so much for that intro. I'm delighted to be back and really excited to be spending more quality time with you through this conversation. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity. Power is my intellectual obsession. I think about it all the time, and I'm hoping that our conversation today can help a lot of people understand power and what it means for themselves.
Yes, likewise. Okay, so for those of you listening, Payal and I have done a lot of research together, and we have conversations all the time about like new exciting topics. And she was telling me about some research that she's been diving into recently on leadership and empowerment and hubris and how it can show up in the work setting. And few words that she said that I really wanted to tackle today was, how does a leader empower their team? And then what do the leaders not understand about once they do empower their team, about what can happen, what behaviors, what tendencies can show up that one would consider on the darker side that is not in the research. She was telling me about all these things. I'm like, we got to talk about this on the podcast. So we're going to touch on that. And then we're going to touch on ego management, which I think is so helpful for anybody, but especially for those who deal with a lot of people. There's a lot of dynamics in your team or at your company. And so we're going to dive into all of that today. Let's start with the empowerment piece. What, from your point of view, from what you know, what you've researched and experienced, what are some common ways that leaders empower their employees in the most effective ways?
For sure. And I'm always glad, as you know, to start with kind of baseline definition of terms that
Yes.
we're going to be using. Empowering leadership is really about leaders motivating their employees to their highest potential. And some of the examples are, my leader might delegate to me. They might involve me in decision-making. They might ask for my input. The leader can share information with me, can coach me, which I know is a word that resonates with you. And some leaders can even allow me to figure out my goals and to solve problems on my own. This can happen with individual employees. It can also happen with teams of employees. Now, what we know is that when leaders empower their employees using these behaviors, lots of good things happen for the leader, the employee, and the organization. Let's start with the leader. As we all know, in current times more than ever, leaders can't be everywhere all the time, and they can't come up with answers to every problem. So when you engage in these empowering leadership behaviors, you're actually relieving yourself as a leader of some of the burdens that you might carry. And more likely than not, you can have your employees focus on day-to-day tasks. And as a leader, you rightfully so can focus on more strategic, higher level tasks, commensurate with your role as a leader. For employees, we know that employees who are empowered report higher levels of meaning, impact, competence, and autonomy. Those four dimensions actually comprise empowerment. That's how we actually define it in the research literature. And who doesn't want more meaning, impact, competence, and autonomy as an employee? Other outcomes include higher levels of employee commitment, learning, job satisfaction, performance, and lower levels of outcomes like turnover intentions and absenteeism. At the organizational level, we know that when leaders are engaging in more empowering behaviors, this also impacts the environment broadly, right? You have a culture of engagement with your employees. So a lot of positive outcomes can follow when leaders are doing the behaviors that I've described.
Yes, and beautiful. And everyone listening, hopefully you're doing one or at least all of those things, because it does make an impact. And that's a lot of what I would do when a company hires me to come in. I'd done those kind of secondhand. I wasn't really realizing that that's what I was doing. But once you start learning these definitions, like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Now I know why the impact is felt. Now I know why they feel empowered, they feel motivated, or they want to come to work and get more things done. They're excited. That all makes sense. When a leader does these things and gets their team to an empowered place,
Mm-hmm.
what does a leader need to know after that?
Yep.
That they may not know, that can cause a lot of heartache, headache, and maybe time suck.
Yeah. I appreciate, by the way, what you started saying there, because more often than not lately, I think of myself as a label giver to people. When I teach, I can give people knowledge and words, right? Like vernacular, vocabulary to start labeling what they do or see in their work settings. So what you said resonated with me as a teacher on that level. All right, so let's say I've empowered you as a leader and you're reporting or feeling higher levels of psychological empowerment, the meaning, the impact, the competence, and the autonomy. The disconnect that I see between the research on empowering leadership and the reality of what can happen is that the research hasn't fully caught up, I would say, to exploring the darker side of empowering leadership. So let's say that you empower an employee and that employee starts to feel entitled. You know, there's a colleague in my field who once used the expression contented cow to describe employees who are empowered. And this is a real concern for leaders. And in their minds, when I often consult with companies, what I hear leaders say is, if I share my role, if I share my responsibilities with employees, you know, I'm going to then be responsible for having to manage this darker side. So in addition to the entitlement, we also hear and see a little bit in the research, but not a lot, that leaders are concerned about errors. What if your employees who are entitled make mistakes? Those can be costly, to borrow your expression. That can become a time suck for leaders to have to then fix, because leaders are still accountable back to their leaders at senior levels and to the organization. So if your entitled employee is screwing up, leaders are going to find it stressful to even think about empowering because it's risky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about it from a business standpoint. A leader who has a team wants that team to perform to the best of their ability. So they're going to invest in people like you and myself to get their teams to that level. And then I think it could be maybe natural for a leader to think, okay, well, now that they're there, they should just be able to take care of themselves. And in a lot of situations, maybe that is the case. But I think also what you're describing is like, now that they feel so trusted, or things have been going well for so long, that culture is one of openness, they can maybe rest on their laurels or get a little complacent with the growth that they've been putting in, and then kind of coast. Maybe they hit a plateau. Maybe they feel like there's things are just good. So there's no reason to put that radar on to scan for problems because there hasn't been any really. Or so if a leader is there and they're like, okay, well, James, if you're telling me that if I empower my team and then there's gonna be this darker side, what can we do about that?
Right. Right. This is a paradox, right? Lots of
Yeah.
good follow from empowering leadership, but a dark side exists, and we cannot ignore that underbelly. And I philosophically always teach my students most of the concepts in our classes have a good, a bad, and an ugly side. So I'm appreciating the richness of us unpacking this with empowering leadership. So one tactic I always recommend to leaders, which has been discussed again a little bit in the research, but not backed up with data as of yet, is incrementally empower. Go slow. Try to see if you can build a relationship with your employees where you do feel the trust, as you mentioned, and then pay attention to your employees' track record, right? You're not going to hand over your task responsibilities in full as a leader in one full setting. You're actually going to try to do it, in my mind, in pieces. And that way you can see, how does the employee respond? How do you feel as a leader? And you go from there and you grow from there. So that's my first tactic that I would recommend, is go slow, do this incrementally. The second tactic is where a lot more complexity gets introduced. So some of the research suggests that when people start to feel powerful, that power intoxicates us. Even people with the best of interests and intentions can start to feel that power makes them perceive that they're immortal, invincible, that no one can touch them. So this corresponds to what we're describing, to what empowered employees might start to experience. Now that gets tricky, right? Because if power intoxicates, it helps us, helps is not the right verb, but it actually narrows our lens. We start to see things myopically. We start to disregard the opinions of others around us. We start to behave taking more risks. So knowing that, I think my second tactic would be to actually figure out, as a leader, how can you manage the egos of your employees? And the research suggests that there's two tactics for this. So this is, again, under that second recommendation. When an employee feels hubris, for example, exaggerated self-confidence, or is focused only on themselves, a leader should try to figure out how they can get the employees to start to cultivate empathy and humility. So there's a new book on power that just recently came out by Julie Battilana and Tiziana Cassiaro. Julie is at the Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Tiziana Cassiaro is a professor in management like myself at the University of Toronto. They call hubris and self-focus the poisons of power. Again, going back to that intoxicating nature. And they describe empathy and humility as the antidotes to those poisons.
So what you're talking about is ego management now, right? How to get somebody out of themselves to be so that self-centered and to fall into victim to the power, and to embody empathy and humility. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
That's the antidote. Okay. Now, anyone listening can probably guess that empathy is a good thing. And you've read it in many different personal development books, emotional intelligence books. Empathy is key. I think a lot of people don't really understand like what empathy is, or how to use it, how to activate it, how to strengthen it, how to lead with it. And then I still think, this is borrowing from Brene Brown, that humility is seen as weakness, and that if I am, or humility can be tied to vulnerability, and vulnerability is weakness. And if you're holding a specific title, there may be a series of expectations that come with that title, depending on the culture, or depending on the industry, or depending on maybe the gender of the leader, or the age of the leader. And all these things can kind of get confusing, and we can just fall victim to having to upkeep this standard that may not need to be there. And so by activating humility, maybe we lower that status, or we lower that power. And that's maybe why someone doesn't want to do it. And maybe we can just riff on this for a while. How does one activate or embody empathy and humility regularly?
Yeah, It's important to understand that empathy is a skill. It can be developed. We can learn how to be empathetic in our day-to-day interactions and choices. So one tactic that you can use every day is to notice the language that you're employing. People who are empathetic tend to talk in language such as we and ours. People who are less empathetic tend to talk with language like I and mine. Another realization that can help day to day is to honor the interconnectedness of our world, which I know is a theme that you really believe in and practice with your own life choices. So when you think about your actions or the actions of others, to honor the web, right? Like that connectedness that exists with your coworkers and your colleagues and your leaders, because that helps you become more tuned into the fact that your actions impact other people and vice versa. And so when you're empathetic, you're really trying to understand and sit with another person. The phrase that I like to use most when I teach about empathy is perspective taking. And this is an incredibly important skill, especially in a day and age where we're so polarized. And I think people really struggle to understand the minds or the views or the interests or values of others around them. But that's actually going to help you start to lower the intoxicating nature of power, because you no longer can only talk in terms that apply to you. You're in a world, in a system, in an organization, in a department where you're part of something bigger than yourself. And so I think a lot of these tactics require a shift in your mind, a shift in the words that are coming out of your mouth. I try to practice these every day in my world, and I find those tactics quite helpful to be more empathetic and more understanding of what other people are going through.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of empathy fatigue?
Yes.
Okay. Can you talk about that? Because I feel like someone listening who may not be as empathetic as they'd like to be, can go balls to the wall to go as hard as they can and be empathy rich. And that takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of social awareness. You have to pick up on cues and you have to be attentive and present. And if you're not good at managing your energy or managing your time or resources, that can be a heavy burden to carry that then could distract you from other aspects of your job or your relationships.
You know, it's such an important point, because I've also heard the related expression compassion fatigue. And so trying to be empathetic, let's say as a leader or an empowered employee, can exhaust you after a while. And I think empathy has kind of this dual perspective where we do want it to help others. We do want it to benefit our own perspectives. We also want to have good boundaries. Mm-hmm. So, there's an article that I read on Fast Company recently that said when leaders, for example, share vulnerable information, they should do it selectively. And I think we can borrow from that and say, perhaps people can be selectively empathetic, right? Notice the impact it's having on you. We do want those contented cows to sort of come down from, the ego space that they're occupying, but not to the point where it's draining them of their abilities to be effective in the work setting. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about how you set boundaries. I know for me, I'm somebody who tries to take breaks from being empathetic. Sometimes I just need a little bit of time off to recharge. And you certainly don't want to deplete yourself and offer yourself to someone else to the point where it's overly taxing you and your own ability to show up in your life. I mean, that's counterintuitive, and it's not effective to be empathetic then to even start.
Right. Also, I think empathy to the extreme can also enable, like where you're so understanding that you're not challenging the individual to think different or rise to the occasion or call them forward. Instead, you can kind of keep them stuck in their situation if you're not careful about how you're sharing that empathy.
As a related term, which I know you've discussed in prior podcasts, a lot of companies try to build psychologically safe work environments where it's mm-hmm. safe to speak up and make mistakes and take risks. And I know management scholars are always quick to point out, this isn't like a cozy relationship that you're trying to curate where everybody thinks the same, nobody challenges each other's ideas. People are always yes men and they're agreeing with each other. Psychological safety is actually about inviting diversity in opinion and can support and encourage innovation and creativity in organizations. So I think the point is well taken that we don't want to be empathetic to the point where we're always telling people, it's okay and you're right and you're not going to really, speak your mind. You want to do it in a way where you can still allow the opportunity to perhaps ask the person to think a little bit differently and benefit from that. Both of you can benefit from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you said something about the yes man, and I think that is a very common thing when you have a leader who has a lot of desirable characteristics. Maybe the leader has, just a lot of charisma, a lot of energy. They're very skilled at something. They have a lot of status in the industry itself because of maybe how successful their business is or how well the team is doing. So there's a lot of power that you can have around that individual. I know an individual I'm thinking about right now in my head as I'm describing this, like very, very successful, very, very affluent, very been on top of the game for a long time. And he is around a lot of yes men. They'll just do anything, say anything to stay in his orbit, and can you talk to like why or the dynamics of that? Maybe you've already touched on them, so pull them again, but how do we avoid that?
Yeah, it's an important question because let's think about why a leader would want yes people around them. Is the leader threatened by new information, by views that challenge the leader's own thinking? We know in the decision-making research, confirmation bias exists where we look for evidence to support our own thinking. So to me, the undercurrent is leaders might not be secure if they only want people who are going to agree with them. To me, the best way you compose a team, the best way as a leader, you build kind of your executive leadership team is to find people who are complementary to you and not similar or, homogenous. And heterogeneity can take the forms of, race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status and background and education and knowledge and expertise. And so to me, a leader who is secure will actually look after the best interests of his or her organization and invite the dissenters, right? The ones that can do that professionally and respectfully. Because if all you want is people to say yes to you, all you're really creating is like a mirror of yourself. And that's not how we know innovation and creativity happen in organization. There's so much evidence right now that's coming out more than ever on the business case for diversity. And leaders who are picking yes men are actually acting in complete opposite ways than what that business case for diversity would suggest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a pretty wild concept for sure. You mentioned one of the strategies is going slow. And I'm a big fan of going slow. I think building intentionally, building strategically is the most effective strategy for sustainability. And obviously there's going to be moments where you have to move faster than other times, but overall it's just steady, consistent, slow, but it has some interesting connotations depending on where people come from. But is there an example that you can think of, or maybe something that you've observed or read that gives us can paint us a picture of what that going slow process looks like? Because I think a lot of us can fall into the trap of, let me get my team to where I want them to be as fast as possible.
Yep.
And I get that because, it costs money and you want to offer a certain quality of service within your business, and that all makes sense. And there is such thing as the right pace, and I would say most of the leaders that I work with move faster than slower, but they often make more mistakes than those who move slower. But they also get to places faster, which means they can own a market. They are kind of the trailblazers. And so there's it's like, choose your poison, Any insight there?
I'm going to talk about a theory called the situational leadership theory. It's by two scholars, Hershey and Blanchard. And what the scholars talk a lot about is you want to understand the readiness of your employees. And that readiness can take the form of two factors: how competent are your employees and how committed are your employees? So let's start at the low end. If you have an employee who's not very competent, but highly committed, probably engaging in a different kind of leadership behavior for that employee will be more important than an employee with different characteristics. So let's say I don't have a lot of competence, maybe I'm early in my career, but I'm this like eager beaver and I'm like ready to roll, right?
Mm-hmm,
Like I'm ready to hit the ground running. My recommendation for that particular leader would be try to engage in behavior that capitalizes on the emotional connection, but recognize you might have to be more directive when it comes to the tasks. You don't have to show up and expend energy to get the employee on board. You actually have to help the employee do their work. Let's then imagine, what if you have an employee who has some level of competence, but isn't committed, right? The leadership behaviors start to shift there because maybe you need to give this particular employee more coaching. Maybe you need to engage them, figure out how to motivate them, but you can feel comfortable giving them some type of work because they do have competence. Now, what if you have an employee who's highly competent, can do the work, but maybe isn't always consistent with their commitment? You might want to delegate to that employee, but also keep an eye on them, right? You can trust that they're going to get the work done, but if they're not fully committed, you might need to like check in and make sure that like they're staying on track. And then finally, let's say you have this highly competent employee and highly committed employee. You can pretty much feel comfortable empowering them because that's the safest combination of characteristics. So the situational theory of leadership, again, combines competence and commitment in an employee, and then suggests that leaders can pivot their behaviors. And I think the biggest takeaway is leaders should not engage in behaviors that are static. You have to kind of understand the needs of the situation based on the makeup of your employees, and then you can behave accordingly. And this takes time and energy for leaders to understand. But, the worst case scenario is you're delegating to an employee who's highly committed, but low in competence. That's not going to work, right? You have to understand the fit between your employees' characteristics and then making adjustments to your behaviors as you go.
That's really helpful. I think that's, like you said, a constant pulse that you're going to have on someone, because as those leaders or employees grow and take on more responsibilities, they may be lower. They may start high on competency, but then go lower in competency because they're rising up to another level. And
Exactly.
maybe that drop in competency, because now they're in a new space, could also drop the commitment because it's not coming as fast as maybe it once was or once did. And so you as a leader have to be able to read that and say, okay, how do I need to approach that? Do I need to emotionally engage them again? Let me lead in with that. Once I feel that's there, okay, now what skill sets do I need to help them improve in?
Yeah, because if you're high in commitment and low in competence, I might need to make the decisions as a leader on the tasks. So leaders can recognize that's where their skill set, needs to emerge or where they can lean in. If you have some level of competence and you're not committed, maybe the leader thinks we need to talk, like we need to figure out how to engage that employee again. And maybe the leader is still going to make the decisions on the tasks. But yeah, I think in any relationship, you're not always going to have the same variables at play, and understanding changes over time, like you're describing in terms of employees' competence and commitment, can be a lot of important data for leaders to process.
Yeah. That's really, really good. Okay, so staying on that, from a leader's perspective, what would you say is one of the top 1 or 2 skills within this empowerment piece that we've talked about so far that you think leaders need to be able to cultivate if they have a chance at, one, being an effective leader and growing their teams to be successful all around?
Yes. So I'm going to give you a 3-part answer that comes from a paper I just published with some colleagues in MIT Sloan Management Review. It's called Why Leaders Resist Empowering Virtual Teams. So it's the intersection of empowering leadership and the reality of today's work settings. What we talk about in the paper and what I think would be most important for leaders in the empowerment space to think about are three related concepts. The first concept is your motivation to lead. I think it's critical for leaders to step back and ask, why am I in this role? What brought me here? Why am I staying in the game? The motivation to lead research suggests that affective ties, emotional relationships can be part of the reason that employees feel that their leaders are invested. So I encourage every leader listening to ask, how motivated are you in terms of those emotional ties? If those ties don't work for you, then that's okay, right? Like, at least understand that. The motivation to lead research also suggests that some employees will feel an obligation to lead and to support others. So the takeaway here again is for leaders to really think critically and deeply what brought them to this position and what's keeping them there. And to understand those metaphoric motivation buttons, because then you can act accordingly, right? So if you're someone who values emotional ties, then you can practice selective vulnerability. You can talk to your employees and coach them and make adjustments in your behavior to match and support your motive to lead. That's number one. The second content that I would recommend to leaders is to think about how comfortable they feel with giving up control. So some people feel that events happen to them. You have been known to say, which I agree with, events happen for us. So I think leaders in the empowerment space should think about, where does control kind of manifest in their lives? Do they feel like they have to clamp down on everything and make every decision? Can they sort of relax that, step back, and practice some of this incremental approach that we've been discussing? And when you understand how comfortable you are with control and whether or not you can sort of lend that to your employees, you're going to make better decisions about how you want to empower. So one quick illustrative example, maybe you're comfortable as a leader giving employees certain tasks that are not visible, but important to the employee to do or to learn from. Another example is maybe you can give an employee a highly visible task, but stay connected to the employee as they work on it, right? Satisfy your own needs for control. And the first step is actually recognizing what those are. The last perspective I would give in terms of understanding empowerment for leaders is, what is their perception of themselves? Are they secure as a leader? Do they feel threatened easily when employees are successful in their job roles? You know, as a leader, are you inclined to help elevate your employee? Or are you going to be worried that your employee is going to take over your job or outshine you? And so I really think the motivation to lead, the perspectives around control and risk, and understanding your own sense of self and where your own ego might be at play, that's going to help employees or leaders, in this empowerment space, and to feel safe empowering employees, which is actually what they should be doing.
Right. And when they lead them with that empowerment that you're talking about, while also knowing how to handle the quote unquote darker side of what will happen once they're empowered, they're going to have more confidence and conviction in their delivery of all this information. And it won't ever go to the lows that we're talking about, because you have already thought of that beforehand. You could be much more strategic. So you're saving time on the back end too.
I'm a big believer in exactly what you've just said. And I really want to double click on this. I think leaders should be proactive, right? It's not logical to look at empowering and empowerment as a zero-sum game. I lose as a leader and my employees win. Some leaders will also say, I'm never going to empower. It's just too risky, right? These black and white definitive statements, that's not the reality of how organizations are structured. You're probably going to need to empower at some point, including if you go on vacation. And so really the goal, I think, of this podcast is to empower leaders, no pun intended, to figure out what makes sense for them. And a lot of that starts with understanding their own selves in combination with understanding who their employees are.
Yes. There's recently I've been calling myself out when I enter binary thinking. And I've with the help of Dr. G, who we've talked about many times, he's helped me see the continuum thinking, where it's not like you either are a truth teller or you tell lies. It's how truthful are you on that spectrum? Are you high truth or low truth, right? Because we all do varying degrees of things. And so it's not like you're one or the other. It's how much of something are you, and you can rise and fall depending on the situation or the context. And so I think by having people view their skill or their belief or their attitude on a specific thing as a continuum rather than a I'm this or that, they don't put the label won't create such a firm reality, right? The spectrum allows you to maneuver, flexibility. You're fluid. You can change depending on the choices and the decisions and the actions that you take. So that's been really helpful for me recently. Did you want to add anything to that?
I couldn't agree with you more. And Mark Guadagnoli is such a thought leader in his own way on these and related topics. Continuum thinking frees us. And yet, as humans, because we want our worlds, according to decision-making research, to be simple, we actually fight that freedom, right? We don't actually give ourselves the gift of opening up our thinking and being expansive. The decision-making research has talked a lot about how we're going to satisfy, so we're going to settle, we're going to make the best choice that's good enough because our brains can't handle complexity. There's not enough time in the day. And continuum thinking might be complex to some people, but as you've pointed out, it actually releases you from being in a fixed mindset or being tethered by labels. And whenever I teach about power, I always tell students, I said this last week during my first week of class in both my courses, power is messy. There's often shades of gray. It's very rarely black and white, and relationships are such, right? Like, look at any relationship that any of us have in our lives. Can we look at any relationship and say it's singularly good or singularly bad? That's
Nope.
probably unrealistic if you say from a binary perspective, it's entirely good or it's entirely bad, and you can define good and bad as people want, right? There's probably a mix. And so I support what you said, and I encourage people listening to, again, try not to be tethered by either this or that, and really to try to start introducing the word "and" in their life.
Yeah. Oh, well said. The labels, I think, help those that crave certainty have a
Oh,
clear
yes.
cut expectation of what is happening, and it's like that is a form of control. Like, I need to be able to identify you. I need to be able to put you into a box so that I can protect myself from you, or that I can understand you at a deeper level. And so labels aren't bad altogether, but the trick with the label is, like, once you do that, then nothing, it can't be anything else. And that's why continuum thinking is so helpful, because on sides of that continuum are general labels. But again, you can move very quickly in and out of each side depending on who you choose to be in that moment, how you're thinking about something, and or what environment you're in. So it frees you from the prison that a label can put you in.
Beautifully said. I couldn't agree with you more. As you were talking, I was thinking about like my own professional experiences where there's often ebbs and flows, right? And interactions with people. And some relationships, can evolve even as, again, the situation changes, as the needs of maybe your tasks at hand change. And giving ourselves those degrees of freedom and that room to shift and to expand, I actually think that's the gateway to better thinking, more positive interactions,
Mm-hmm.
and really allowing other people to lean in just like we may be with shifts and changes in who we are, the demands of the situation that we're in.
Yes. And this is making me think of James Clear's quote from Atomic Habits. He says, every thought, decision, and action you take is a vote for the type of person that you want to be. And I think you can take that and maybe take out the type of person you want to be, and the type of skill that you want to cultivate, the type of whatever it is that you're trying to get better at. Like, every thought, every story you create, every person you're around, every action you take, every environment you're in is like pushing you in one or the other in that on that continuum. It's like the more choices you make the more choices you make that are, let's say, positive, if you want to put a label on it, then you're going to tend to be more on that positive side because of the momentum you're building through your thinking, through your behaving, and through your action taking. So just kind of use that as a mental frame, everyone listening. I know that's helped me, is like, who am I thinking like right now? What do I want to think right now? What actions are going to help me be more of whatever it is that I'm trying to be, and make more of those choices? Put yourself in more of those environments. And over time, you build the infrastructure in your head to just think like that way. So then you can fall into the label of whatever it is that you're trying to label, and it be more permanent because of how you've conditioned yourself to be. Now, that can also work negatively on the other side if you're not aware of how powerful you can program yourself and what can happen there. So just be aware of how you're showing up, how you're thinking, what you're feeling, and make adjustments when necessary.
I have two stories that I'd like to share with your audience that reflect what you've described. And the overarching theme of these stories is, I've learned through my own life and career experiences, everyone has broken pieces inside of them by virtue of living the human existence. It's what we do with those broken pieces that differentiate people. And I am consistently impressed when I meet folks who are making really good decisions for themselves and making progress towards choices that consistently reflect their values. So the story I'll share first is, I have a friend, he's a Black man, he's an attorney in corporate America. He grew up with his parents being divorced at an early age, around 2 years old. His father was incarcerated. His mother worked in the prison system, and he grew up as a latchkey kid. So right away, James, knowing that background, can we all predict the trajectory of his life, statistically speaking, based on the reality of what we know happens in the world? Well, it turns out that this young man decided that he was going not only to college, but to law school for one reason. His why was never to become like his father. And what ended up happening is he graduated from law school, and in that snapshot of his life, he paused and he realized that why was not going to be sustainable, which of course you and I would not be surprised by. Your why has to be about your narrative within. It's not about anybody else. He's also shared with me, because I asked him how he went the corporate route, because how many, Black men are attorneys in corporate America. And he said that he tried representing clients in private practice, but it was too difficult for him to represent other Black men. It was too upsetting. He felt like he was never doing enough. And so he pivoted towards the corporate sector. And I remember as he was telling me the story, I just kept thinking, what a series of good decisions he has made, one in front of the other, that has cultivated actually not only his sense of self, his ability to appropriately disclose information and be vulnerable with people around him, but he's actually curated his successful career through this narrative that he was sharing with me. So I couldn't agree more with what you said. And I think this story illustrates the choices we make reflect and define us. And that's where our agency lies. I also have a story from my own life. So as you know, I had recently bought property, bought being the no longer accurate verb. And for reasons entirely out of my control, I lost the property. This was just last week. Perhaps I could look for deeper meaning. I could assume, is the universe punishing me? It's been a long road on this process. I called my best friend from college, and he shared with me that his parents, who live in a different state, have put in offers on 12 homes where he lives because they want to buy a second property there. 12. Damn. I would stop counting after 3. So one, he gave me that data that I'm not the only one that this happens to. And more broadly, he used the expression, and I thought of you. He said, it's understandable to feel deflated. It's not okay to feel defeated. And I feel like the story of my friend who's the attorney and my own housing experience illustrates what you said, because there are choices in how we can tell the narratives of what happens to us or for us. And what I realized after talking to my best friend from college is the universe isn't picking me out. There's no like singular lens that the universe has zoomed in on Payal Sharma and said, we're going to make this as complicated as possible. And guess what? My realtor sent me new listings today, and I found another community that we're exploring. And you and I both know that there's no scarcity perspective when it comes to housing or relationships or jobs or anything in life. It's actually what we build as the lens or the filter through which we're seeing interactions and events and what happens either again to or for us.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for sharing those stories with us. This is just daily deposits. You know, if you want daily deposits into your bank account in real life, you got to add some value. You got to do some things, right? Same thing with your mind, daily deposits. What type of thoughts are you thinking? What type of stories are you reminding yourselves of? What type of content are you consuming? Who are you listening to? What are you eating? Are you exercising? Like these simple things that we tend to forget. Like there's something that recently I've been using as a mantra, and it's do simple better.
Oh, can you please put that on a hat for me to wear?
Yes. Oh, we'll get some clothing, put it on there. Do simple better. Like I've fallen victim so many times to the more. And being someone who's growth oriented, like it can be a natural progression. More money, more houses, more cars, more. Like we have this illusion sometimes that more is going to be better. And it isn't necessarily the case. And most times there is a tipping point where too much now becomes a burden. And that is not used to say that you shouldn't go for what you want and push limits, because I'm all for that. I think now my limit has shifted from adding to subtracting and refining what it is that I choose to have. And that is where the simplicity lies. And then just doing the simple better.
I have another story from my life that I can share that for me, what you've just said resonates. So this is slightly an emotional story, but it's actually quite superficial. I texted my friend Jordy yesterday, 7:15 in the morning, and told her the following. I have made a commitment to myself, and I want her to hold me accountable that when I go to teach, that I'm wearing professional clothes. I'm not wearing clothes that are casual that I normally wear when I work from home. That's number one. The clothes have to be professional. Number two, I'm going to wear clothing that fits my body. And the reason I say this is my body's changed a lot through the workouts that I've done since I moved to Las Vegas 3.5 years ago. It's not about the size. It's not about the number. It's about clothing that actually fits my body today. The third point I texted to Jordy is I want to wear clothes that make me feel good. In combination, I have realized already in 1 week of teaching, I'm actually simplifying my wardrobe, and I'm starting to add to a collection of clothes that I had already started last year of items that I'm going to donate either to the business school because there's a community closet for professional clothing, or to Dress for Success. And I'm simplifying my wardrobe because I'm wearing what reflects my identity. I'm a professor. What reflects my lifestyle. I'm physically fit and active, and what I love, right? Like I want to put on clothing that makes me feel like I'm feeling lit up inside. And of course, we all know that translates to like standing straighter and shoulders are back and more confident and better posture. And the last thing I texted to Jordy is my mentor at the Wharton School, where I was before UNLV, was diagnosed with brain cancer a year ago, as you know, and moved into hospice last weekend. And that news pushed me down a cliff, because Sigal Barsade has always been immortal and invincible in my mind, and in the minds of so many others. Health and death are the greatest equalizers in our society, right? They don't skip over you because you're a full professor at Wharton. So the last thing I texted Jordy in all of this thinking about my wardrobe is, it's the best way to honor Sigal is to show up in these clothing, in these items, because Sigal always did that. She was always dressed professionally and was always immaculate in her wardrobe. And I feel like when you simplify your life, you're actually, again, clearing up space to live most authentically, to honor not only who you are, but the people around you who have helped you in terms of who you've become.
Yes. What's coming to me is simplify to amplify.
That needs to go on a tank top.
We got a whole wardrobe. Let's keep going. Yeah, it's hard to be simple too because we have attachments to things. And it takes a lot of releasing maybe stuck emotions or just old paradigms that we learned from authority figures or friends or, people that we thought were what we wanted, but then realized that's not what we wanted. And we have to like prune our thinking. Like otherwise, you're just going to have a wild bush or a tree just growing out of control and you're not in control anymore. So it isn't until you simplify where you're like, is this needed? Is this fundamental? Is this a necessity? No? Then work on minimizing that or delegating it or deleting it or donating it, whatever fits. But when you move with less, you move faster. So, and I think you appreciate more of life. We're not meant to have a lot of things. We're not meant to know a lot of people. Like we're meant to just operate within our tribe, whoever that tribe is, and however we choose that, it's up to you. But simple is always better. So there's that.
People to look at their calendars, for example, and take one thing off their schedule that they either don't have to do or that they don't love to do. One thing in the next week.
I think that's a great challenge.
Yeah.
I think also to add to that, if they have already done that, then maybe take something that like in your business, right? Where it's like, oh, I want to add this new dimension to my business. Well, before you do that, make sure that all the other current aspects of your business are performing at the highest quality that they can. Because a lot of people, myself included, can fall under the trap of thinking, oh, I got to add more things to my business. I got to add more services. I want to do this mastermind, that event, and I want to do it like that. And, oh, I got to create this program. It's like, well, before you move on, did you already quote unquote perfect what you've already done? And if you haven't, then don't move on. Otherwise, you're just going to create a whole bunch of 80% things that aren't going to be really helpful for anybody. And you're going to end up getting frustrated, continuing to burn all of your energy, creating things that don't need to be created, and instead redirect that energy to innovating what's already working and making it better. And then you're going to learn some really fantastic processes, systems, mental modes of thinking that can help you scale faster the next thing that you do. So I think those are some ways that you guys can implement some of the do simple, better thought processes.
This also reminds me of some decision points I've reached in my own life. So I learned the hard way last semester that if I'm mentally taxed and I'm feeling any sort of extreme level of stress, I cannot go to the gym and work it out and also overtax my body. There's a limited capacity that my mind and my physical health both have, and trying to use physical workouts to work through the stress consistently is not going to work. And so my body actually broke down. And nowadays, following continuum thinking and what you've just described, I've given myself a looser framework. My goal every week is 4 to 5 workouts. So I can pick. Every day, I also try to eat between 3 and 4 meals. This is in consultation with my trainer, Brian Blessing. And what I realize is when we're not locked down to what we expect should happen, it allows our minds to kind of open up and think a little bit more creatively and expansively. And so I've made this commitment to myself that I will do 4 to 5 workouts a week, contingent on if I'm sleeping and if I'm eating consistently, because fuel is obviously very important. And it's important to have a healthy relationship with food as fuel. Mm-hmm. And so I just know for me that language, 4 to 5 workouts a week, 3 to 4 meals a day, I check in with Brian pretty consistently. that's how I find that my body's no longer feeling like it constantly needs like repair or recovery. And I'm really enjoying my workouts as a result, because now I have this flexibility that still allows for highly satisfying days and weeks.
Yes. And what you just described is self-awareness on what works best for you, and not being afraid to explore those things regardless of how unpopular it may be. Because other people that have a different way of thinking need constant structure. Like if they have choice, they're always going to choose not to do it. So they have to like be super specific and regimented with their things, and that's what allows them to thrive. Now, that being said, that a question for that type of individual may be, does it have to be like that? And do you like it like that? And if the answer is yes to those, then nothing, keep going. But if it's like, I know that I need it, but it's like, I don't want to have it be that way, then maybe now there's some room for opening up your way of thinking and being a little bit more flexible and creative and flowy with your calendar or your schedule, and going step by step, slowing it down, incremental progression, so that you can ultimately find your style. That's what's beautiful about this life, is like, there is no right or wrong. It's what works for you. And
that's like the perfect title for a podcast, right? Like what we're talking about is to figure out what works for you.
Yeah. Right. And I'm sure there's overlap, obviously, like we're humans, so we have a lot of the same things that we come equipped with. But at the end of the day, like winning is finding you and your style. Like that's where life gets fun, because then you just build from there. And whatever you build from there is fun to build, and it's sustainable, whatever it is that you're building, because it's you. And it's not built on what other people think or any external environment or situation that you can't control. It's built from within, and no one can take anything that's built from within. So I wanted to quickly revisit the second thing that you said. You mentioned the two antidotes being empathy and humility. And I wanted to touch on humility a little bit more. What would you add here for strategies or practices for people to be a more humility driven in their work and relationships?
Yeah. So I think humility is really kind of this important ongoing conversation that we have in our own heads. The power research in this book, Power for All, by the authors I mentioned, talks a lot about that we should really try to pause and recognize we're mortal, we're not immortal, and that power, for example, is fleeting and not permanent. And so I'll give you an organizational example that I find really fascinating that your reviewers probably are a little bit familiar with. So when De Beers came onto the game of like the diamond industry, they were responsible for the advertising and the coining of that expression, a diamond is forever. And of course, diamond sales skyrocketed. De Beers eventually became a monopoly. Well, power is fleeting, it's not impermanent, and De Beers perhaps would have benefited from a dose of recognizing they weren't immortal and finding humility, because what happened over time? Societal trends have shifted the sales of diamonds in at least 4 ways. 1, gender norms are changing. Some people are choosing not to get married and not to buy diamond rings at all. Number 2, there's luxury goods that are now creating competition for diamonds, such as technology. Number 3, diamonds are now being produced in synthetic labs. And so the provision of diamonds has changed. It's not only coming from suppliers like a De Beers. And number 4, you have companies like Blue Nile, which are providing diamonds direct to the consumer. What has happened over time? De Beers has lost its control and its influence over the industry. And so I think a De Beers and an individual would both have benefited in this scenario from trying to stay grounded, paying attention to what's happening around them, and creating systems that involve checks and balances where people can actually come to you as an individual or as an organization and look for opportunities for learning. Try to be more realistic in understanding shifts in your industry, in your work, for example, and the relationships you have. And so I think humility is about being realistic and not trying to assume that what you see is actually the reality of what's happening, because De Beers didn't see this coming, it sounds like, from what I read in this book about that situation. And
Yeah.
something like organizational humility could probably have helped them be at least a little bit more prepared for the changes.
That's such a great example. And it's also so challenging because it's like that, let's just say the De Beer leader, CEO at the time, his thought process could be, I got us here. So I know what it takes to lead this company. I know the right next step because my last step was right. And so you like your success can almost pigeonhole you sometimes if
Yep.
you're not aware into thinking that like you are a success because you made a successful decision. And maybe there is truth to that, but also like with that comes an almost like a responsibility to have to keep that up, and then I think all great leaders have this is what I was talking to Mark about yesterday. I was asking him about all the people that he's coached and what was some common characteristics in the executive leaders that he coaches or CEOs. And he goes, they're all a good, how do you say it? They're all stubborn. They have a good amount of stubbornness. And that stubbornness allows them to push through on ideas when other people would fail, especially when it's hard and everyone else is saying no, and they still do it and it works. And we glorify that. We glorify everyone else is wrong, even though they're telling me I need to do something different. I'm gonna bet on myself. And so we can hide in that, or we can believe that that is an accurate way of thinking that actually blinds us from what's happening. Like the last decision I made, everyone thought I was wrong and I was right. This situation, everyone thinks I'm wrong. I believe that I'm right. And so they have evidence.
Right.
And so it's like, man,
right.
how hard is that for the individual who has to really look in the mirror at where do they go? Who do they believe?
And, humility really refers to the idea that we can acknowledge our own limitations and that we have accurate perceptions of our own abilities and our accomplishments. So in the example you just provided, I think it's critical that people realistically assess why their first decision was successful and not to immediately assume that the next decision is going to have the same identical contextual factors. Maybe there's a change, right, that shifted over time. So yes, the past should predict the future in a lot of ways. If I was right then I can be right again here. I just think that wedding yourself to that as a certainty is doing a disservice to the reality that sometimes your second decision might be in a different situation with different people, and that things do change. And so you can't just make that assumption. I mean, we do love to assume that if X worked there, then it's going to work here again. And it could. It also could not, for reasons that might not even be within your control. So give yourself at least that bandwidth, right, to think a little bit more creatively and expansively.
Yeah, I like what you said about really chunking down the components of the decision making itself, because that brings the emotion out of it and it makes it a little bit more concrete. And when it's concrete, other people can look at that and see if it's sound, and it kind of takes the emotional out of it. It makes it more strategic and easier maybe to maneuver once you have like a process in which you do things. And then you can isolate one of those factors in your decision to see if it still holds up in today's market. Right? Like, but if it's just this general, like I succeeded then, I'm succeeding now, but there's no real flow to that. There's no real system or steps to that thinking, then you're like shooting in the dark. Or maybe you just, your process so well, you don't know how to articulate it, and you go into the next venture with that hope, but it's not the most sound way of thinking, I guess.
Yeah, it's almost like we could recommend to leaders to do a retroactive analysis and coding of the factors that led to success. I mean, De Beers could potentially, utilize this by thinking, okay, back then we had this coined expression, diamond is forever. What was happening around us? Gender norms were traditional. A lot of people were actually getting married, and there wasn't competition for the supply of diamonds. But today's a different reality. So what coined, advertising slogan could we come up with today that actually reflects our understanding how the world has shifted and is no longer what it once was when we were able to create the monopoly that we did?
Yes. So maybe a tactical exercise that we can co-create right now for everybody listening is choose an area in your life that you're wanting to repeat success in, or go to the next level of whatever that success looks like to you. And then find in that same area of life, if it's business, if it's relationships, if it's health, pick one of those and remember a time where you made a successful decision or you had a successful experience in that domain, and break apart what were the components that led to that success from your current perspective. Who were you hanging out with around that time? How active were you around that time? What type of exercises were you doing? What type of marketing were you doing? If it was a business example, who were you partnered with? How many employees did you have? What type of trainings did you do in your company? Who was involved? Like, as many factors as you can, because that is your recipe. This is what they talk about in the NLP research, neuro-linguistic programming, is every time you feel something, think something, or experience something, there is a strategy there. If you've done it once, you can do it again. You just have to realize the system and the sequence and what happens inside of your body that creates that situation that you're in. So if you have, let's say, if you experience happiness, there is a strategy for your happiness. There is a strategy for your depression. There is a strategy for your optimism. And by putting yourself back in the situations in which you were feeling those things, now you have access to the strategy that led you to feeling it, which means you can duplicate it, which means you're in charge of how you feel, and you don't have to outsource your power to someone or something else. You can grab that back and say, I choose to feel this and do this and be this. And then you live life on your terms. And that's where you really succeed.
Yeah. I mean, I think from a mental health perspective, which I know a lot of people are, experiencing higher levels of depression and anxiety nowadays than ever because of world events. Can you identify what your triggers are? Can you minimize those triggers? You don't have to do it alone, right? You can ask for professional help, and you can figure out, like you described, kind of the recipe, and try to encourage the creating of conditions in your life that facilitate more of the good stuff. And I'm a firm believer that, you live your life individually because you are responsible at the end of the day for your own self-worth, your own self-esteem. As you've alluded to, it should never come from anything outside of you. You also need support, right? You need those stable, helpful, safe, mature relationships. So kind of utilize not only your own inner wisdom, but resources around you to kind of arrive at these recipes.
Yeah. Well said. Oh, this has been fun. Thank you, Payal, for dropping some knowledge here today. Is there anything else that you want to touch on before we wrap up?
Yeah, I have been really drinking the Kool-Aid of what I'm about to share. And it's something I feel really strongly about telling to people. I almost said to students, because I'm still in that teacher mindset from our first week of classes. You create the life that you want to live. And I'll say that again, you create the life that you want to live. And what I would encourage people to do when they think thematically about this podcast is to ask themselves, what are the steps that they need to take to create the life that can be the most enriching, the most fulfilling, the most rewarding? And that can carry over into personal relationships as well. I shared with you that I am doing everything I've always dreamed of in my career. I graduated with my PhD in 2011, so I'm just past that decade mark. And I can say that I'm doing everything I ever dreamed of because of a lot of hard work, a lot of support from people, and then also recognizing aspects like timing and luck that can play an important role in what happens in your life. And so I just encourage people again to recognize their own agency, where you have control, where you have choice. Don't wait for things to happen to you. Really create events that happen for you along the way. And for women especially, I think this is critical because we're socialized into like romanticized and idealized visions of the world. You are the director of your own script, and really embrace that role as you continue to make good decisions that move you closer to the life that you deserve.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being you, for being as diligent as you are in the research and really making things practical. So thank you for being my friend. Thank you for being associated to just so many epic things. And I always love doing this with you.
The feeling is entirely mutual. So thank you, James, for all of this.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Go out there, be your own 1%. Share this episode with someone that you feel just really needs to hear this message. Maybe they're a leader. Maybe they're struggling in some sort of relationship. Maybe they just need a perspective shift. If you have someone in your mind right now, send this to them. Help us get this word out to more leaders so that we can have higher quality lives. All right. Much love, everybody. Until next time, I'll see you later.